Hello, Year Nines. I'm sorry I can't be with you. I wish I could be there. Welcome back to Term 3, Semester 2 Textiles. So I'm off with the musical this week, but I'm looking forward to being back with you next week. Today you're going to be doing a lesson on fabric properties. It's really important that you understand the different properties of your fabric because you need to make the best selection for the fabric that you want to use for any project you're working on. So today, as you can see, I've left a lovely big messy pile of fabric here. I'll find a box to put this in before your lesson and leave it on the front table. So today you're going to be experimenting with different properties of this fabric and writing up a little table about it and then thinking about how you could use it or manipulate those properties. So I'll just show you on the board. Try and not show you the messy textiles room that's full of musical costumes at the moment. So when we look at fabrics, we divide fabrics into lots of different categories, so you don't necessarily need to know the name of a fabric to know, how you could use it or what would be best for. So we often talk about fabrics either being natural or synthetic. That's talking about what their initial fibre is from. So a natural fibre would be something like a cotton or a silk or a wool, all of those things that come from a natural element. Synthetic fibres are obviously chemically made. They can be combined with natural fibres though. So then when we look at whether it's natural or synthetic, we could then look at other properties like whether it's got stretch to it, whether it's got a knit or a woven method for actually putting the threads into a fabric, whether it's a light or a heavy weight. Then, so this is the table that you're going to be doing up for yourself, that we can look at all sorts of things. So once we've discovered whether it's natural or synthetic, which I'll show you how to do, we can then look at the stretch, look at the knit and weave. We can look at how badly or how well it creases, because if you're making something where you want lots of very obvious pleats on it, you want it to hold a crease when you put that crease in. If you want something really flowy, then you don't want it to crease a lot. We can look at the drape of the fabric. So we can look at if we're making it for a beautiful gown, we'd want it to fall really beautifully, or maybe you'd want it to be more structured and not to drape and fall nicely. You might want it to deliberately sit out. Then you're going to do a column on how I could use this fabric. So on that bit there, you'll put a little scrap of the fabric. You might know what some of them are, and as I go through this, I'll talk to you about it. Let's see if I can put the camera up here, get a good view for you. Right, so there's a couple of ways of firstly knowing whether a fabric is natural or synthetic. Two techniques that you're going to be looking at are burning and bleaching. So I'm going to light a candle. Safety first, of course. Please be very safe with this lesson, don't be silly about it. So if a fabric has any kind of synthetic qualities, it's going to melt. If it's more natural, it's going to burn. So if I'm going to grab, for example, this is organza. I know that this organza is very synthetic. So straight away, I know that it's going to burn. So I'm going to cut a little swatch for myself, about that big. And I'm not going to hold it directly onto the flame. I'm just going to hover it a little bit above the flame. And I hope you can see this on the video. It's actually going to start to melt. I'm not even putting that in the flame, just a little bit above it. Some of you might recognize this fabric and this technique from how we made all the rose petals in Beauty and the Beast. Wrong musical. There we go. So straight away, that fabric, that actually burnt a little bit on the corners, because I melted a bit too far. But you can see how the fabric is actually melted in. Hopefully that is catching well on the camera. If I was to take a natural fibre, like this is 100% cotton. This is a cotton drill. It's a fairly heavyweight fabric. I could hold this above the flame and I know that this one is actually going to catch fire and burn. You see that? It's catching fire. So I want to put that one out straight away. As soon as you get to know these fabrics, you'll kind of feel whether they're going to be synthetic straight away. So maybe just choose not to put the natural ones over because we don't want to have a fire in the room. So that's one method for knowing whether it's natural or synthetic. The second way is from bleach. I'm obviously not going to pre-pour this because I won't be in for several days and I don't want to leave a thing of bleach sitting out here. So I'll leave this in its tub, and you can pour just a tiny bit of bleach into these little containers. Now, a natural fibre, when bleach is applied to it, it's actually going to pull the colour out of that fibre. So I'm just going to draw a little smiley face. Bleach. Doesn't happen instantly, we sort of need to wait for a moment. But in front of our eyes, we're slowly going to see it fade where I've drawn it.
David Supek. David, could you please contact the gym on 4806? Thank you.
Now that message is recorded forever in this video. Hopefully you can catch that on the video. It's actually starting to fade so that you can see it's pulling that colour out. This is called discharge dyeing. It's about pulling the colour out of the fabric. The longer I leave it, the more it's going to fade. On this black fabric, it's going to turn quite orangish. If I want to stop the bleach process at any time, I can dunk that in vinegar and it will stop bleaching. But I want to get it a little bit more pulled out than that. I could put more bleach on it as well. I might bleach down here again. There's lots of different ways I could use this. Bleach dyeing is actually an effective embellishment technique on a natural fibre fabric. People can use it by drawing straight onto the fabric. You could even do things like you could put down a piece of lace and then spray the bleach over top of it so that it just picks up the holes in the lace and it gives you a nice lace effect on your fabric. So hopefully you can see that starting to take shape. It's looking fairly orange here. I don't know if it's catching on the camera. So there's bleaching. So you could try bleaching a couple of different fabrics. If it doesn't bleach at all, then you know it's definitely synthetic. If it only bleaches a little bit, you might sort of conclude that, well, maybe it's partly natural, partly synthetic. That's the same with the burning it as well. If it burns a little bit that kind of starts to melt, you know that maybe it's a mixture of natural and synthetic fibres. Other properties that we can look at are its stretch. So this is a cotton that has a one-way stretch. Now this is something I do whenever I'm fabric shopping. I always touch every fabric that I see because I need to sort of feel them, to feel how soft they are, to feel where their stretch is. Every fabric will have stretch on its bias. So this is the cross grain. This is the grain, sorry. This is the grain of my fabric because it's going along my selvage. This edge here is my selvage. It's got the little holes in it. That's the actual edge that's sealed off when it's on the bolt of fabric. So on my grain, there's no stretch to it. However, on the cross grain, it's used some slightly elastic threads to give it a bit of stretch. So I could use that. Now on this cotton that I was just using before, this doesn't have stretch either way, either on the grain or the cross grain. But it does on the bias. The bias is the diagonal between the grain and the cross grain. It does actually have a nice bit of stretch. So you might hear of a bias cut dress. That's what it's meaning. It's meaning that natural stretch that comes from the bias. So I would play around with stretching fabrics. I might find a fabric like this that has stretch in absolutely every direction that I pull it. So you call this like a three-way stretch, even though you could just say it's an infinity-way stretch, really. And you can find they might have different amounts of stretch. You know, some fabrics, this one I was thinking about, this fabric has quite a lot of stretch in one way, but it has just a little bit of stretch the other way. So all of these are good things to note when you're choosing your fabric and how you use your fabric. Okay, the next one we could look at would be crease. So I could look at a fabric and think, I want this fabric to hold a crease really well if I'm, say, going to sew a pleat into it. So I could just, with my fingernails, can you hear that sound? Crease down the fabric, like I'm folding the fabric and just with my fingernails, just tucking that pleat in. And that's actually holding that crease quite well. I could even just look at how stiff it would hold if I was to pleat it or anything like that. So I can play around with the feel of the fabric when I do different things to it. If I was to get a fabric like this, it's not going to hold a crease very well. It's got a line. It's definitely got a line, so you could say it will crinkle. So if you're sitting on top of it for a long time, so if you made an evening gown out of that, but somebody's sitting on it all night, they're going to get up and have a little bit of crinkle on them, but it's actually not too much considering how much I use my fingernails to make that crease. So you'd say this wouldn't hold a crease very well, so I wouldn't use that to do pleats that I wanted to really hold a shape. You could then look at drape. So drape is how the fabric falls. This is really important. How heavy does it fall? Sometimes you think, oh, I want a really lightweight fabric to sort of drape beautifully, but sometimes a heavier fabric, so this purple one's actually heavier than this white one, the heavier one's actually going to drape nicer. And so see how the fabric sort of falls. Whereas, well, this is a very extreme opposite. This is Hessian. This Hessian's not draping nicely at all. But maybe I want it to stick out, and maybe I don't want it to drape that way. The organza that we played with before, when we did the burning, this one has a little bit of drape, but it's a very different, it's not a heavy fall of drape, it's sort of so lightweight that it just sits out and the air kind of holds it out a bit. So I've got all sorts of fabrics here for you to play with. I've got some fleece as well. So fleece does have some stretch to it. It's got lots of stretch one way, barely any stretch the other way. You could look at all sorts of properties and how you think you would use this. I've got some wool blends. I don't think that's a pure wool. I think that's a part synthetic wool, but you guys can tell me that once you've done some testing to it. I have some jersey. Jersey is a typical t-shirt material. Make sure you pass these around and make sure you feel every sort of fabric. Think, what have I worn before that might be made out of that? Jersey, you'd think a t-shirt. Cotton, you'd think your school shirts and your school dresses. A silk could be a nice silk shirt or a skirt or a dress, lots of things out of a silk or a satiny silk. By the way, satin is not actually a type of fabric. Satin is a finish. The fabric itself would be, say, a silk that might have a satin finish because it's a shine. It just means like a shiny finish. We've got lightweight cotton. This is I'm trying to remember the name, a poplin, cotton poplin. It's very cheap, lightweight cotton, can be useful for lots of different things. So have a play around with these fabrics today. Do up your table for yourselves. Once you've done that, I actually want you to take a piece of fabric and try making something by manipulating all those properties. So whether that's by doing some bleach dyeing on it and creating a cool image out of bleach dyeing, whether that's using some of the melting techniques to make some interesting things, whatever you make, put that in your folio as a little sample. So hope you have fun with this lesson, and I look forward to being with you again next week. Bye, you nines.